I'm Demelza Carlton, and I'd like to introduce you to the cursed coast of Western Australia, a place of hidden reefs and rocks where many ships have met their doom. The year was 1834. The Swan River colony that would one day become the bustling city of Perth, Western Australia, was only 5 years old. Shipping was the lifeblood of the colony, for every vessel that arrived brought food, supplies, news, and new migrants. The Cumberland steamed into Fremantle for the first time in February of 1834, carrying a load of shingles from Launceston in what was then Van Diemen's Land, present-day Tasmania. As only a small cutter, her captain advertised her services to transport goods from Fremantle. The cargo she was contracted to carry included 20 tons of goods belonging to the Bustle family, worth over £1,000, a lot of money at the time. This included the Bustle family jewellery and their silver. The Bustle family are well known in Western Australia because of their involvement in another shipwreck that happened much later, but that story is for another episode. On the 28th of August 1834, Captain James McDermott and his crew of 3 sailed south in the Cumberland. To the west and south of Fremantle there's a long chain of rocks, reefs and islands, including an area of moving shoals, aptly named Shoalwater. On the afternoon the Cumberland left Fremantle, a heavy storm blew in, bringing strong northwesterly winds that could easily send such a small vessel onto one of the rocks or reefs hidden beneath the waves. During the storm, the Cumberland disappeared. For 4 weeks, the newspapers reported that there were no tidings of the Cumberland. Other vessels sailing the same route found no trace of her. The newspapers were full of cheerful suggestions as to what had happened to the ship, that those on board had shipped to sea and were swamped, or that the little cutter had been driven beyond the Sound and those on board had died of thirst. Given the limited resources of the infant colony and the belief that the vessel was lost, there was no land and sea search undertaken, as volunteer sea rescue would today. Lives, ship and cargo were just declared lost. It wasn't until the 3rd of January in 1835, 4 months later, that reports started to circulate about what the newspapers called a most villainous and systematic robbery of the wreck by some fishermen in October of the previous year, accompanied by news of how these men had been arrested for illegal salvage. It turned out that someone had found the Cumberland, but they'd said nothing about it. In the course of the trial, the story came out. 7 men, John Cousins, William Keats, John Thomas, his son James Thomas, William Ledyard, Richard Thorne and William Ward, were out fishing for a weekend. John Thomas had invited Ledyard along to the boys' weekend with the suggestion that a fit of seasickness would do him good, if only they knew what they'd find and what it would cost them. All 7 of them set sail in 2 boats. They spent a couple of days fishing around Carnac and Garden Islands before heading south around Point Perrin to Penguin Island to do some shooting. Of what, I don't know. Possibly some of the local sea lions or seabirds. Luckily for the local wildlife, instead of shooting, the men turned to salvage. They discovered the wreckage of the Cumberland, strewn up and down the beach for several miles. Bits of the boat, as well as the majority of its cargo. Even the chest that contained the silver had washed up, but the chest had been hacked open with the silver nowhere to be found. The jewellery casks were intact, and the men divided it up among themselves. A particularly gruesome find included the body of one of the crew, who'd been dead for over a month at this point. Apparently, when they touched the body, the head fell off. Despite the state of decay and the lack of head, they recognised the man as a sailor named Reese because the corpse was missing a finger. The men carried away all they could, then came back later to collect the rest, but high tide and rough conditions kept them from retrieving any more. A man named Hall was sent to investigate the wreckage in January, where he made another grim find, the remains of Captain McDermott, whose dried-out body was missing a thumb and a foot. Cousins was persuaded to turn informer against his fishing buddies, so he avoided a charge and a sentence. He was the lucky one. The other 6 pleaded guilty to theft of goods stranded from the wreck of the Cumberland. 5 of them were sentenced to transportation to Van Diemen's Land, where they'd be convict labourers for between 7 and 14 years. John Thomas only served 4 years of his sentence. He died in Launceston Hospital in 1839. His son, James Thomas, served 6 months' imprisonment and hard labour in Fremantle, which he spent carving the sandstone steps at the front of the Roundhouse Jail. Those steps are still there today. As for the missing silver, it was never found. That's all for this week's Cursed Coast. Next week, the curious tale of the ship's cat.